Blood dripped from the girl's braids onto the white hospital sheets, one drop at a time. Her mother stood frozen, staring at the machine's slow, rhythmic beeps that mocked her silence. Outside, the students laughed, unaware of what they had unleashed. The school's principal called it an unfortunate accident. But when the mother finally looked up, her eyes held no tears, only purpose. By sunrise, everyone in that school would learn what it meant to lose everything. What happened next shocked everyone and set off a chain of events no one saw coming. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we start the story, comment below and let us know where in the world you're watching from today. And if you find this story impactful, don't forget to subscribe for more. The rain came early that morning, soft at first, then hard like someone throwing pebbles at the roof. Drops stuttered down the windows of Grace's small room and made silver rivers on the glass. Outside, the street smelled of wet concrete and the iron tang of the city. Lights from the shop signs blinked through the rain and painted the wet pavement in red and gold. It felt like the whole world was trying to wash itself clean, but the house smelled of old books and lemon soap, and nothing outside could change that. Grace sat on the edge of her bed with her school uniform folded on her lap. The navy skirt smelled faintly of chalk, and the white blouse still had the soft crease where her hand had pressed the fabric the night before. She smoothed the skirt with careful fingers, though she had already decided she would not be able to iron out what sat heavier on her chest. Her hair was braided close to her head, a single line of careful knots that her mother had taught her to make. Grace's skin was the color of warm chocolate, and her eyes were quick and watchful, like a bird's. She kept her mouth small, as if words could spill like water, and she did not want to waste them. There was a scar on the inside of Grace's left wrist, a thin pale line that puffed when she moved. It was a small thing, but she touched it now as if it were a secret map. The scar came from the summer when a neighbor's dog had lunged at her and she had fallen into a patch of nettles. Her mother had carried her home and wrapped her wrist in an old scarf. Grace remembered how her mother hummed a hymn while she cleaned the wound, as if the song could stitch skin together. Little things stayed with her, soft songs, the smell of lemon, the steady weight of her mother's hand on her shoulder. Mary, her mother, was already in the kitchen. Mary moved from the stove to the counter with the rhythm of someone used to doing many things at once. She had a slow piano of motions, each step sure and deliberate. There was flour on her apron and a smear of jam on one finger. When she saw Grace watching, she smiled like a window being opened. Her smile held both warmth and a warning. "Eat," she said, and her voice carried the tired strength of a woman who had learned to be strong first, gentle second. The house was small and full of careful arrangements. On the mantel sat a picture in a silver frame, Mary and a man who was not there anymore, both younger, both laughing like they did not know the world could break. The picture had been leaning forward for years, slightly askew, as if it remembered falling once and never quite regained balance. Grace sometimes imagined the man's laugh as a sound she could call to, like ringing a little bell. She never did. Some things in the house belonged to the invisible. When they left for the bus, the rain had calmed enough to make the air smell like the sea. The school bus hissed as it pulled up, and other children jostled and laughed, the sound bright and careless. Grace climbed aboard and chose the window seat by the back. The bus ride felt like the inside of a bottle, safe and shaken. She watched faces blur past, the neighborhoods passing like illustrations from a storybook, and kept her hands folded in her lap. There was a teacher who taught history, Mr. Daniel, who had once noticed Grace reading while other children tossed paper planes. He had called her name once in the corridor, Grace, as if speaking to a small bird, and handed her a note about a writing contest. She had kept that note in the inside pocket of her school bag, folded twice, a private thing. The world sometimes offered small kindlings, and Grace collected them like embers. But the school had other kindlings, too, things that burned differently. There were boys who laughed like knives and girls who learned to look away. They wore their confidence like armor and did not know the weight of soft things. Tyler and Connor sat with voices like smooth stones, and they liked to see how far they could roll the stones across other people's skin. When Grace walked past the lockers, she could feel the space they carved with their eyes. It was a tiny cut that left room for a larger wound. The narrator watches this scene with quiet interest, noting how the ordinary becomes the seedbed of crisis. The bus, the note, the scar on a wrist, these are not accidents in a story like this. They are the small, steady facts that will push someone beyond fear. The narrator does not rush to anger or pity. The narrator records. A seed falls in shadow and waits for rain. At school, the corridor smelled of polish and damp coats. Grace moved like a careful thing, head down, keeping to the edges. A girl she knew, Hannah, waved from a locker and smiled like she owned the right to kindness. Hannah's smile was quick, a bright coin, and when she offered Grace a squeeze of her hand, Grace felt something loosen for a breath. It was a small thing. Friendship is often a small thing, but it mattered. Grace kept Hannah's kindness like a stone in her pocket. An evening last week brought a whisper. Someone in school had started a rumor, small and mean and true enough to sting. Grace had heard it from a classmate who had meant no harm. A boy said she was different, that people like her did not belong in their places. She had swallowed the words like smoke and walked home under a cloud that tasted like metal. Mary had noticed the way Grace had moved that night, hands fiddling with the hem of her blouse, and had asked the question nobody likes to ask. Grace had answered in a whisper that did not cover everything. Her mother took the answer and did not force more out of it. She made tea instead and wrapped Grace in a towel like a harbor. There are ways to shelter that sound like small mercies. Outside the schoolyard, the trees leaned with the rain's fatigue. A pigeon pecked at a crumb, oblivious. The narrator steps back and speaks with less feeling, describing the patterns as they are, a place where power gathers in small groups and pushes outward, where cruelty feels like belonging to those who wield it. Observations are clear. The school is not a battlefield yet, but the lines are drawn. Grace's locker was a small metal cave. She kept inside it a folded paper, the one from Mr. Daniel, and a charm, an old locket that had once belonged to her grandmother. The locket held nothing but the shine of memory. When she opened it, she thought of hands that had traced the same metal and hummed a tune while rolling bread dough. That memory was a ballast in her chest. She shut the locker softly and walked to class. On the far side of the yard, two boys leaned against the wall and watched the others like kings of a quiet country. Their laughter struck like a bell. When they spotted Grace, their faces hardened into a practiced blankness. Later, their mouths would shape words that had been honed by repetition. For now, there was a pause. The space between that pause and what comes next is where fear gathers. Mary closed the front door slowly when she left for work, the hinges whispering like a secret. She looked at the house the way someone might look at a chessboard before making a move. At the sink, she had cleaned the locket, wiped it until it shone like hope. In her pocket, she had a set of old keys, heavy and cold. They felt like an argument she had not yet begun to win. Grace did not know, sitting at her desk with her pencil balanced on a margin, that a day would come when those keys would find their place in another lock. She did not know that a small black stone in her pocket, Hannah's friendship, the locket's memory, would need to hold a weight that no small thing should carry. She only knew the rain and the folded note and the pull of the clock as its hands made patient circles. The narrator returns, softer now, to the human inside the story. Watch the way a girl breathes before a storm. There is a moment, thin as the space between two breaths, where the world is still ordinary. That moment can be stolen, or it can be kept. The story will test which choice is left to them. The day split open in a way that felt small at first, a thin sound like the crack of a dry twig underfoot, but then it widened until there was no ignoring it. Grace heard the sound before she saw what made it. It came from the corridor, a cluster of voices, half laugh and half knife. She looked up from her notebook and felt the way a room can tilt when someone whispers a name that belongs to you. Look, there she is. Tyler's voice was smooth, the sort of voice that could trade a kindness for a cut and not blink. Connor laughed, a short, practice sound. The two boys had the gift of making a crowd follow where they led. Grace kept her head down. She had learned to fold herself small, to take up as little space as a folded note. A scrap of paper slid under her desk like a caterpillar. Grace's fingers closed on it before her mind could warn her. The paper was folded twice, edges soft from being handled. On it someone had scrawled a few words in a hand that made them look heavier than they were. Go home, black girl. The letters trembled a little, as if even the pen had been ashamed. Her chest tightened. The air in the classroom changed temperature. Faces around her blurred as if seen through rain. Hannah, who sat 2 rows up, watched Grace with something hovering between worry and curiosity. She mouthed a soft sorry. It felt like a small rescue, like a hand reaching from a different room. Grace tucked the paper into her sleeve and pretended not to notice. But paper, once it has been written on, keeps its shape. The teacher, Mrs. Clark, called for silence. Her voice was even, the practiced calm of someone used to smoothing ripples into stillness. She did not know what lay folded at Grace's wrist. She could not see the way the words sat like stones in a pocket. After class, the corridor hummed. Lockers slammed like doors to other lives. A group clustered by the trophy case, their laughter a low engine. Tyler and Connor let the joke stretch, feeling out how wide the road of cruelty could be. They had done it before, sharpening their words on children who did not answer them back. Grace's steps were small and careful. She moved with the rhythm of someone trying not to wake a sleeping thing. Outside, the rain had started again, thin and steady. Grace wrapped her coat tight and walked along the path that led toward the bus stop. The ground smelled like turned earth, and for a second she let herself breathe the wet air as if it could dilute the words on the paper. Then a stone hit the back of her calf. It was nothing much, a pebble tossed by a passing boy, but it set a chain moving. A voice called her name, not graceful, not kind, but sharp with amusement. Hey, Grace, nice locket. Did Grandma give it to you? She turned. A group had gathered under the oak tree, their faces half hidden by hoods and shadow. Someone laughed. The locket that hung at her throat, the small circle of metal that once belonged to a grandmother, felt suddenly heavier than the air. Hands reached out as if to touch it, to take, to show. She held it closer. The bus ride back was a tight space of breath and bodies. Someone bumped her elbow, another tapped her bag. Tyler leaned across and said, low enough that only the nearest could hear, You know, people say your kind don't belong here. He smiled, the smile that had been taught by older boys who thought themselves kings of empty fields. A few others turned to look, their faces sliding from curiosity into a sort of cruel hunger. Grace stared out the window until the world smeared into a watercolor of gray streets and neon signs. At home that afternoon, the house smelled like lemon and slow cooking. Mary was at the sink, pressing dough with a flat, patient palm. Her hands moved like a hymn, steady and sure. Grace sat at the kitchen table and unfolded the paper. The words were the same. The ink had hardened at the edges like old bruises. Mary read the scrap without flinching. Her face, always so open, narrowed into a line that Grace had never liked to see. Mary put the paper down and washed her hands as if she could scrub the letters away. What did you tell them? Mary asked. Her voice was calm, but it carried a depth like a well. Grace shook her head. She hadn't told them anything. Cruelty did not need permission. It found its way. Mary sat down opposite her and reached across the table to take Grace's hand. Her palm was warm and rough with hard work. For a moment she hummed that old hymn, the same tune she had hummed when she washed Grace's nettle-scarred wrist years ago. It should have been comfortable, but there was something else in Mary's eyes, something like a plan turning in a pocket. "You should not have to carry this alone," Mary said. Her voice threaded the room like a rope. "Tell me everything." Grace told what she could. She trimmed the edges of the story like someone pruning a rose bush. She kept the thorns to herself. Mary listened, her jaw set. When Grace finished, Mary stood and went to the windows. She watched the street where boys played and men passed. Her fingers curled over the sill like roots seeking hold. There was a photograph on the wall that Grace had not remembered until that afternoon. It was taken years ago. Mary, younger, arms wrapped around a man with a laugh that pulled at the edges of the world. The man's face was gentle, kind. Grace had always looked at that photo as if the laughter in it could be called back. Mary's hand rested on the frame and then moved to the sideboard where a set of old keys lay, heavy and dark. She lifted them, turned them over in her palm. The keys had a history. They were not just tools. Grace watched as if from behind glass. A small dread pinched the edges of her stomach. "You must be brave," Mary said. She did not say it like a promise. She said it was like a decision being made. That evening, a message bloomed on Grace's phone from someone whose number she did not know. A photo, her earlier in the corridor, the locket visible against her blouse. Someone had taken the picture without her knowing. The caption was a single sentence, trimmed of doubt, "Not welcome here." The message had a time stamp. The photo had been taken at school during the morning break. The narrator steps back and speaks without color. The image is a record. The image is a weapon. Children trade such things like currency. The school becomes a place where privacy is thin and cruelty is amplified by technology. No single face bears all the blame. The harm is in the pattern. But the narrator leans in again, with human warmth, to notice Mary's small, almost invisible reaction. She folded the phone into her palm as if holding a small coal. Her lips pressed together. Grace watched her, and for a brief second believed her mother would move like the hymn, gentle, tending, healing. Instead, Mary's hands tightened on the phone. There was a slow, deliberate movement, as if she were turning a key in a long-locked door. Mary said, quietly, "They will learn." It was not a threat dressed in heat. It was the cold setting of something certain. Grace felt the room change shape. The small paper in her sleeve, the photo on her phone, the laugh in the corridor, they aligned like stars. Something that had been smoldering found air. A neighbor's radio hummed the evening news. A story of an old grievance from the town, the kind of story that makes people remember names and old injuries. Mary listened for a moment, then reached for the keys and put them into her pocket. The keys made a small sound, a clink like a promise. Grace watched, and the narrator, impartial now, notes that decisions are often made in small sounds. The click of keys, the folding of paper, the hush of a phone. Outside, rain tapped the roof again, patient and clean. Inside, a seed opened its shell. It was not yet a plan laid out in full. It was not yet the falling of a building or the breaking of a life. But the first stone had been thrown, and where it landed would change the shape of everything. The next morning carried a silence that felt too neat, like a bed someone had made in a hurry. Grace moved through it without speaking. The rain had stopped, leaving the world rinsed but colorless. Mary stood by the kitchen window, her hair pinned back, her expression unreadable. The steam from her tea curled upward and disappeared before reaching the ceiling. "Did you sleep?" she asked without turning. Grace nodded, though her eyes betrayed her. Shadows lived beneath them like faint bruises. She toyed with the handle of her bag, twisting the strap until it almost cut into her palm. "You don't have to go today," Mary said, voice low. "I could call, say you're sick." Grace shook her head. They'd only talk more. Mary looked at her daughter then, her eyes dark and careful. "Let them talk," she said. "Words don't last." Grace wanted to believe that, but she had seen how some words didn't fade. They grew, gathered, turned into things you could trip on. She didn't say it. Instead, she took her coat, slipped the locket under her blouse, and left with a soft goodbye that didn't quite reach the door. When she was gone, Mary stood still for a long time. The keys lay on the counter beside the untouched tea. Her fingers brushed them absently. In another life, they had opened something simple, a storage room at the school where she used to work before she left under quiet circumstances. She told herself she had moved on. But grief and anger are skilled locksmiths. They know how to find their way back into closed places. At school, the hallways felt sharper than usual. Hannah met Grace near the lockers. Her hair was tied up, eyes flicking nervously toward the others. "Hey," she said, voice careful. "You okay?" Grace managed a smile that was smaller than she meant it to be. "Yeah." "You saw the group chat?" Grace blinked. "What chat?" Hannah hesitated, then pulled out her phone. The screen glowed with the soft cruelty of the digital world. There it was, the photo again. But this time, it wasn't just the picture. Someone had drawn horns on her head, added captions, and comments sprawled beneath like weeds. "Why is she even here? Didn't know our school had quotas. She's trying too hard." Grace read them once. That was enough. She felt something shift behind her ribs, like glass turning in its frame. "Who started it?" she asked. Hannah swallowed. I think Connor posted it first. But Tyler's the one who runs the group." Grace nodded slowly. "Okay." Her voice was thin, but steady. She handed the phone back. "Grace, don't do anything stupid," Hannah said, guilt twisting her words. Grace didn't answer. She didn't know yet what counted as stupid. The narrator steps closer here, noticing the small motions, the way Grace presses her fingers to her locket like someone testing a pulse, the way her reflection in the locker looks like a stranger wearing her skin. Every story has a point where the protagonist stops being acted upon and starts to act. This is the moment before that, the hinge between silence and sound. Later that day in history class, Mr. Daniel noticed the slump of her shoulders. He paused mid-lesson and leaned slightly toward her desk. "Grace," he said quietly, "stay after class for a minute, please." When everyone left, he sat on the edge of the desk and waited. Grace stared at her notebook until the words blurred. "I've been hearing things," he said. "I don't want to believe them. Are you okay?" Grace lifted her eyes. They were sharp, wet but not broken. "They think it's funny." Mr. Daniel nodded slowly. "People hurt what they don't understand. That doesn't make it right." There was silence for a moment. Then Grace said, "You said once that stories can change things." "I did," he said. "Then, why doesn't anyone believe the truth when it's in front of them?" He sighed. "Because the truth doesn't shout. It waits for the noise to end." Grace looked away, jaw tight. Then maybe it should start shouting. Something in her voice unsettled him, a flicker of resolve that was neither childish nor calm. It was quiet before thunder. He almost said more, but she was already packing her books, already gone. Meanwhile, Mary sat in her car outside the school parking lot, engine off, eyes fixed on the building. She hadn't planned to drive there. Her hands had done it on their own, guided by the pulse in her chest. She saw children rushing out, laughing, shoulders pressed together in careless friendship. Then she saw her daughter alone, walking toward the bus stop, head low. Mary's hands tightened on the steering wheel. She had always believed she could protect Grace by keeping her head down, by teaching her patience, politeness, and prayer. But patience had done nothing. Silence had changed nothing. And somewhere between the insult on that paper and the photo on that phone, something inside her had cracked. When Grace came home, she found her mother on the couch, staring at the wall. The keys were gone from the counter. "You didn't have to wait up," Grace said softly. Mary turned. "You didn't tell me it was that bad. I didn't want you to worry." Mary's eyes glinted with something fierce. A mother worries even when she sleeps. Grace sat beside her. The silence between them was heavy but not cold. "Do you remember," Mary said slowly, "what I told you when you were little? That I used to work at that school?" Grace nodded. "You said you quit." Mary smiled without joy. "That's what I told you. The truth is, I was pushed out. Quietly. Some parents didn't like that a black woman taught their kids. They said I was too political. The principal, Mr. Reynolds, told me it was best if I took a break, so I did." She paused. They never expected I'd still be here. Still watching. Grace stared at her. She had never heard this before. Mary leaned forward. "They don't change, Grace. They just get older. They find new ways to do the same thing." Grace's throat felt tight. "What are you going to do?" Mary looked at her with a calm that was almost frightening. "What I should have done back then." The narrator watches this moment through two lenses. One sees the righteous fury of a mother reclaiming her voice. The other sees the shadow that begins to form when rage is allowed to bloom unchecked. Both truths can live in the same room. Grace wanted to stop her. But part of her, the part that had read those words and seen those comments, understood there is something alluring in the idea of striking back, of being seen, finally, as something more than a quiet target. "I just want it to end," Grace whispered. Mary touched her cheek, fingers trembling. "It will," she said, "one way or another." That night, Grace dreamed of the school burning, not in flames but in silence. Lockers melting into one another, hallways twisting like mirrors. And, in the middle of it, her mother stood with the old keys, unlocking doors that led nowhere. Grace woke with her heart pounding, unsure if what she felt was fear or longing. The next morning, when she reached her locker, someone had written across it in thick black marker, "Stay in your place." The letters dripped like they were bleeding. She didn't cry. She just stood there, tracing each letter with her finger until the marker stained her skin. Then she whispered to herself, "Maybe I will." But what she really meant, was maybe not. And somewhere just out of sight, Mary was already moving. The morning of the first twist began with something deceptively normal. Sunlight cutting through thin curtains, birdsong tangled with distant traffic. Grace was almost surprised by how peaceful it sounded. Peace, she thought, had a way of arriving right before things fell apart. At breakfast, Mary moved with an energy Grace hadn't seen in her for months. There was something deliberate in every motion, the way she poured coffee, the way she checked the clock, the way her eyes flicked toward Grace and then away again. "Eat up," she said, almost too brightly. "You've got a long day." Grace hesitated. Her mother's voice didn't match her smile. "Are you okay?" Mary looked up. "Of course." "Why?" "You're acting different." Mary's gaze softened. Just tired of waiting for the world to change on its own. Grace didn't understand what that meant, but she nodded anyway. When she left for school, she glanced back once. Mary stood at the window, watching her walk away. Grace lifted a hand in a small wave, but Mary didn't wave back. She just stared, eyes distant, as though she were memorizing her daughter's outline. The day began like any other until it didn't. At lunch, Hannah was waiting near the lockers, her phone clutched tightly. "Grace," she hissed, pulling her aside. "You need to see this." Grace frowned and leaned in. On the screen was a post from the same group chat, the one that had tormented her. But this time, it wasn't a photo of her. It was a video. The camera shook as it followed a woman, tall, dark-skinned, wearing a gray coat and carrying a familiar handbag, walking into the school office. The caption read, "Guess who's back to cause trouble?" Grace's stomach dropped. The woman was Mary. "What is this?" she whispered. Hannah bit her lip. "People are saying she came here yesterday, after school." Hannah hesitated. "They said she threatened Mr. Reynolds." Grace blinked hard. "That's impossible. She was home." Hannah's voice was small. "The video says otherwise." Grace stared at the screen again. The camera angle shifted slightly, catching Mary standing in front of the principal's desk. Her expression was calm, but her words, though muffled, were sharp. She pointed toward the wall, toward the photos of school board members. Her hand trembled, and then she said something the microphone barely caught. "You'll remember what you did to me." The video cut off there. Grace felt the air thin around her. No, she whispered. She wouldn't. But she remembered the way Mary had touched those keys, the strange calm in her voice when she said, "They will learn." By the end of the day, everyone was talking. Teachers whispered in hallways. Students shared the video between classes. Some laughed, others stared at Grace like she was contagious. When she passed by, someone muttered, "Like mother, like daughter." She ran home. The door was unlocked. Inside, the air smelled faintly of bleach. Mary was sitting at the table, hands folded, eyes distant. "You went to the school," Grace said, not asking. Mary didn't answer immediately. "I went to talk." "Talk." Grace's voice broke. "They're saying you threatened the principal." Mary sighed, rubbing her temple. "People always twist the truth when they're scared of it. What did you say to him?" Mary looked at her, and for a long moment she didn't speak. Then quietly, "I reminded him what he did to me, and what he's letting happen to you." Grace's pulse quickened. "Mom, that was years ago. You can't. Years ago doesn't mean forgiven." Grace shook her head. "You shouldn't have gone." Mary's expression hardened. "And you shouldn't have to suffer for their hate." The silence between them sharpened. Grace wanted to shout, but she could feel something deeper beneath her mother's words. Something she didn't yet understand. "Mom," she said carefully, "why do you still have those keys?" Mary's fingers froze. "What?" "The ones you used to carry when you worked there. I saw them. You keep them like they still mean something?" Mary looked away. "They're just metal." "No, they're not." Grace's voice trembled. "You still have access, don't you?" Mary didn't respond. Grace stepped closer. "You went inside after hours." Mary's jaw tightened. "I had to see what kind of place they turned it into." "Mom, what did you do?" Mary finally looked at her, eyes dark as storm water. "I unlocked something that needed light." Grace's stomach twisted. "What does that mean?" Before Mary could answer, there was a knock on the door. Sharp. Official. Grace froze. Mary didn't move. "Stay here," she said, voice calm. She opened the door to find 2 police officers standing outside, their raincoats slick with mist. One of them, a tall man with gray hair, nodded politely. "Mrs. Miller? We'd like to ask you a few questions." Grace stood up. "What's going on?" The officer looked at her. "It's about last night. There was a break-in at St. Paul's High. Security cameras caught someone using an old staff key." Grace's knees went weak. Mary's expression didn't change. "I already told Mr. Reynolds I went to see him." "Yes," the officer said, evenly. But after he left, the alarm went off. A fire started in the storage wing. Grace's voice came out as a whisper. "A fire?" Mary's eyes flicked toward her daughter. It was small. The officer continued, "We just need to verify a few things." Mary nodded and turned back to Grace. "It's fine. I'll clear it up." But Grace knew that tone. It was the voice of someone protecting, not confessing. After the officers left, with a promise to follow up, Grace stood in the middle of the room, the world tilting. "Tell me the truth," she said softly. "Did you do it?" Mary sat down, exhaling slowly. "I didn't start a fire," she said, "but I wanted them to feel the heat." "What does that even mean?" Mary's hand trembled. "I found files. Locked away. Complaints. Records of what they did to students, kids who never spoke up. Kids like you. And me." Grace blinked. "You." Mary nodded slowly. "When I taught there, I reported a teacher for calling a black boy a slur in front of his class. They ignored me. Then they pushed me out. I was supposed to forget." The room spun. Grace sank into a chair. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Mary's voice was hollow. "I didn't want you to carry my anger. But when I saw what they were doing to you, it was like watching history repeat itself." Grace whispered, "So you went back to expose them." Mary met her eyes. "I went back to make them answer." The narrator slips in here, cool and distant. Every story of vengeance wears the same face, the face of someone who once believed justice could come quietly. Grace pressed her palms to her face. "You said words don't last, Mom, but they do. They burn." Mary stood and crossed her. Sometimes that's the only way to be heard. Grace looked up, tears streaking her cheeks. "Then why does it feel like you betrayed me?" The words landed heavy. Mary flinched. "I did this for you." "No," Grace whispered. "You did it for yourself." The silence stretched. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance. And in that thunder, something inside Grace shifted. She realized her mother's fight, the one she thought was for justice, was now becoming a storm she might not survive. The betrayal wasn't in what Mary had done to the school. It was what she had done to Grace, dragging her back into a battle she never asked for. The narrator closes the scene in a hush, voice low and reflective. The daughter wanted peace. The mother wanted reckoning. And between them, the truth began to burn hotter than either could control. The storm arrived that night, slow, deliberate, and unrelenting. Rain lashed the windows of the Miller home as if demanding entry, and thunder rumbled so deep it made the walls tremble. Grace sat by her bedroom window, the faint glow of her phone lighting her face. Every new notification from school made her stomach turn. The video of Mary at the principal's office had gone viral now, shared and reshared, with captions that cut like glass. "Crazy woman threatens school staff. Like mother, like daughter. Guess it runs in the family." She wanted to turn it off, to stop reading, but she couldn't look away. Every cruel word sank into her like a thorn. Downstairs, she could hear her mother pacing. The sound was rhythmic, almost steady, except for the occasional pause when the floorboards creaked under her weight. And Grace could tell she was standing perfectly still, lost in thought. By midnight, Grace couldn't take it anymore. She went down. Mary stood near the table, staring at a manila folder she'd spread open. Inside were printed copies of the files she'd taken, the old complaints, the ignored reports, the letters from parents that had never reached the light of day. "You're still at it?" Grace asked quietly. Mary didn't look up. "Someone has to be." "Mom, please," Grace said. "You can't fix this by yourself." Mary's jaw tightened. "I'm not fixing. I'm exposing myself." Grace moved closer, lowering her voice. "They're coming after us, Mom. The police, the school, everyone. They think you're dangerous." Mary turned then, her eyes flashing. "I'm dangerous because I don't stay silent." Grace flinched. "No, you're dangerous because you don't stop." For a moment, neither spoke. The storm outside howled, and the house groaned under the weight of the wind. Mary finally said, "Do you know what silence cost me? It cost me my job, my reputation, my peace. I kept quiet once, and they buried the truth with me. I won't let them do that to you." Grace's voice trembled. "But you already have. You've made me the story." Mary's face softened just slightly. "I never meant." "I know you didn't," Grace cut in, her voice sharp. "But meaning doesn't matter anymore. Not when everyone thinks I'm your accomplice." Mary stared at her daughter, guilt flickering across her features. "I did this to protect you." Grace's hands clenched. "Then why does it feel like you've put a target on my back?" A crack of thunder silenced them both. Moments later, there was a faint knock at the door, barely audible through the storm. Both women froze. Mary's expression hardened. "Stay here." Grace's heart raced. "Mom, don't." But Mary was already walking to the door. Through the frosted glass, Grace could make out a shadow, tall, unfamiliar. The knock came again, more urgent this time. Mary opened it halfway. A man in a black raincoat stood on the porch, his umbrella dripping. He looked official, his posture, his voice, his calm. "Mrs. Miller?" he asked. "Detective Lang. I need to speak with you again." Mary didn't move. "It's late." "I'm aware," Lang said, his tone steady. But new information came in. It's important. Grace hovered by the stairs, watching. What kind of information? Mary asked. Lang hesitated. The files that were taken, there's concern they were leaked to the press. Grace's breath caught. Mary blinked. Leaked. Lang nodded. An anonymous tip came from a local email address. The files were attached. School boards in chaos. Half of them are threatening lawsuits. Mary's lips parted, but I didn't. Grace's voice echoed from the stairs before she could stop it. You didn't. Lang looked up, noticing Grace for the first time. You must be her daughter. Grace nodded faintly. He gave a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. You two might want to talk to a lawyer. Things are moving quickly. Mary's voice was cold. We'll handle it. Lang nodded once, then added quietly, I'd suggest you find out who else has your keys, Mrs. Miller. Because whoever leaked those files, they wanted you to take the fall. He turned and left, his umbrella vanishing into the rain. Grace stood frozen. What did he mean? Someone else has your keys? Mary didn't answer. She stared out into the storm, her face unreadable. Mom, Grace pressed, do you think someone followed you that night? Mary's voice was distant. I don't know. Grace moved closer. But you must have told someone who knew what you were doing. Mary's silence stretched too long. Mom? Grace's tone sharpened. Who else knows? Mary looked at her finally. Rachel. Grace frowned. Your friend from church? Mary nodded. She's the only one I trusted with the truth. Grace's heart pounded. Then, maybe she... No, Mary said quickly. Rachel wouldn't betray me. Grace stared at her. You said that about Dad once. The words slipped out before she could stop them. And for a moment, everything stilled. Mary's shoulders tensed. That's different. Is it? Grace asked quietly. Because you trusted him, too. Until he left. Until he said you were obsessed. Mary's breath caught. Don't. Grace's eyes were wet. He said you were consumed by revenge, even back then. That you didn't care who you hurt as long as you won. Mary's voice rose. Enough. But Grace didn't stop. You think you're fighting for justice, but all I see is you turning into the same person he walked away from. The words hit like a slap. Mary turned away, bracing herself against the table. Her hands trembled, her voice cracked. I lost everything because I believed people could do the right thing. If that makes me obsessed, then so be it. Grace whispered, You're going to lose me, too. The sentence landed between them like a curse. Outside, lightning flashed, bright enough to light Mary's face, streaked with tears she didn't bother to hide. I'm doing this for you, she said again, barely audible. Grace's voice was cold now. No, Mom. You're doing it for the version of yourself that never got closure. She turned and walked upstairs before Mary could answer. That night, sleep refused to come. Grace lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every word, every look. Something didn't add up. If Rachel knew, and the files had been leaked, then someone was playing both sides. In the dark, she opened her laptop. A new email notification blinked. The sender was anonymous. The subject line read, You deserve to know who really did it. She hesitated, then clicked. Inside was a single attachment, a blurry still from a security camera. The timestamp read the night of the fire. The figure in the frame was unmistakable. It wasn't Mary. It was Rachel. Grace stared at the image, the realization sinking in like ice. The betrayal Mary refused to believe in was real, and now Grace had proof. But as thunder shook the house again, a darker thought crept in. If Rachel had leaked the files, she wasn't just trying to ruin Mary. She was trying to destroy them both. And the question that haunted Grace as the night dragged on was no longer who did it, it was why. Because whoever Rachel really was, she wasn't finished yet. The morning broke, gray and heavy, the kind of sky that felt like it was holding its breath. The entire town buzzed with attention no one could name yet. Rumors had already begun circling. Someone had leaked the entire file collection to every local news outlet. Every complaint, every ignored plea, every hidden report about the school's pattern of abuse, it was all out there now. Grace hadn't slept. Her head throbbed from the long night of shock and disbelief. The image of Rachel outside the school at midnight replayed in her mind like a ghost that refused to fade. She'd printed the photo, folded it, and kept it in her pocket. A secret weapon for when the truth finally had to come out. Downstairs, Mary sat at the table, her laptop open and her face pale. The news anchors were already talking about her like she was a criminal mastermind. Sources claim the files were leaked from Mary Miller's personal device, the reporter's voice said. Grace stepped into the room, quietly. "They're blaming you," she murmured. Mary didn't answer. She stared at the screen, her fingers gripping the edge of the table until her knuckles turned white. "They were always going to," she whispered. "That's what people like this do. Twist the truth until it fits their comfort." Grace hesitated, then pulled out the folded photo. "Mom, you need to see this." Mary took it slowly. Her eyes widened as she saw Rachel's face on the security footage. "This can't be," she breathed. "Rachel?" "She was there the night of the fire," Grace said. "She took your flash drive. She's the one who sent the files." Mary's voice broke. "No, she's my friend. She helped me after the hearing. She betrayed you," Grace interrupted, her voice trembling. "She made it look like you did everything. She wanted you to take the blame." Mary pushed back from the table, pacing the room. Her breaths came fast, uneven. Why? Why would she do this? Grace swallowed hard. Maybe it wasn't about you. Maybe it was about what she'd lose if the truth came out. Mary froze. "What do you mean?" Grace looked at her mother, her expression grave. "You said Rachel worked in the district office once, right?" Mary nodded slowly. Grace continued, "What if she was part of it? What if she helped cover up those reports? If she thought you'd expose her, she'd have every reason to stop you." Mary's knees almost gave out. The betrayal hit her like a physical blow. The woman who had prayed with her, comforted her, who'd promised to help her fight for justice, had been the one feeding her to the wolves. Her voice turned cold. "She used me." Grace reached for her hand. "Mom, please don't do anything reckless. We can go to the police with this." Mary pulled away. "The same police who ignored us? Who called you a liar when those boys put you in a coma?" Her tone darkened. "No, this time they'll hear the truth whether they want or not." Before Grace could stop her, Mary grabbed her coat and keys. "Mom!" Grace cried, but Mary was already out the door. Rain had started again, soft but steady, soaking Mary's clothes as she drove. The world blurred past her windshield, her mind consumed by one name, Rachel. She reached the school's auditorium an hour before the scheduled press conference. The board had called an emergency meeting to address the controversy. Rachel would be there, Mary knew it. The parking lot was already full of cameras, reporters, parents whispering to each other under umbrellas. The air was electric, a storm waiting to burst. Mary stepped out, head high, rain dripping from her hair. Her presence turned heads immediately. Some gasped, others whispered. But she didn't care. She walked straight through the doors, every step echoing with fury. Inside, the auditorium was lit harshly by stage lights. Rachel stood at the podium, her tone calm, composed. "This unfortunate situation has deeply saddened us all," she was saying. "Our hearts go out to the families affected by this tragedy. But let me be clear, the school has always prioritized the safety and well-being of its students." Mary's voice cut through the room like a blade. "Liar!" The crowd turned. Rachel froze mid-sentence, her face tightening. "Mary," she said softly, "you shouldn't be here." Mary stepped forward, her voice trembling with controlled rage. "No, Rachel, you shouldn't be here. Not after what you did." Rachel's expression shifted to feigned confusion. I don't know what you're talking about. Mary reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the printed security photo, holding it high. You were there the night the files disappeared. You leaked them. You set me up. The room erupted into murmurs. Cameras flashed. Rachel's mask cracked for just a second. Then she forced a smile. That's a serious accusation, Mary. You have no proof that's me. Mary's voice grew stronger. I have enough to make them listen. And I've already sent copies of this to every news outlet that covered your lies. Rachel's poise faltered. You don't understand what you're doing. No, Mary said, I finally understand exactly what I'm doing. The room was silent now, except for the hum of the lights. Mary took a deep breath. You covered up reports of abuse, Rachel. You let bullies run free. You let children suffer, and when I tried to expose it, you made me your scapegoat. You destroyed my family's life to save your career. Rachel's lips parted, but no sound came. Mary's tone cracked, filled with pain and fury. My daughter almost died because of people like you. Because you thought silence was safer than truth. The crowd stirred. Parents whispering, teachers shifting uncomfortably. For the first time, people were seeing Rachel's polished charm for what it was, rock-covered in gold. Rachel finally broke her silence. You think you're righteous, Mary, but you're reckless. You'll burn the whole place down, just to make a point. Mary stepped closer, eyes glistening. Maybe it needs to burn. The air thickened. Rachel flinched, sensing something irreversible in Mary's tone. Grace suddenly burst through the back door, soaked and breathless. Mom, don't, please. Everyone turned to her. Grace ran to the stage, her voice shaking. You don't have to destroy yourself for this. The truth is already out. Mary looked at her daughter, her anger softening for the first time. They have to understand, Grace. Grace took her hand. They will, because I'll tell them what really happened. And she did. In that silent, stunned auditorium, Grace told her story. She spoke about the bullying the night of the attack, the way the teachers had looked away. Her voice cracked when she said Rachel's name, but she kept going. Every word was a wound and a healing all at once. By the time she finished, no one moved. Reporters stared, parents cried, and Rachel sat frozen, her career dissolving before her eyes. Mary's hand tightened around Grace's. Her anger had burned itself out, leaving only exhaustion and a strange, fragile peace. Rachel stood slowly, her voice hollow. You've ruined me. Mary met her gaze. No, Rachel, you did that yourself. When they left the auditorium, the storm had finally broken. The air was cold, clean, and new. Outside, Grace leaned against her mother's shoulder. What happens now? Mary smiled faintly through her tears. Now we live. The sun began to pierce through the clouds then, soft beams breaking the gray. The world wasn't fixed. It wasn't fair. But for the first time, it felt like truth had found a voice, and it wasn't going silent again. And as they walked home, hand in hand, Mary knew something she hadn't in a long time. She hadn't destroyed the school. She'd freed it. The following morning arrived in fragile silence. No sirens. No reporters. No angry knocks on the door. Just the faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft chirp of birds daring to return after days of storm. Grace sat at the kitchen table, sunlight spilling through the half-open blinds. The world felt different, lighter somehow, as if the weight pressing against her chest had finally eased. She sipped her tea slowly, her thoughts drifting between what had ended and what still lingered. Her mother hadn't come downstairs yet. Mary had barely spoken after the confrontation at the school. The two of them had returned home in silence. No victory speeches, no anger, just exhaustion that went bone deep. Grace's phone buzzed beside her. A text message from an unknown number appeared. You did the right thing. Keep fighting for the truth. Lang. She smiled faintly. The detective's tone, once detached and professional, now sounded almost proud. Maybe he had believed her after all. Maybe the truth, once spoken aloud, had a way of finding its defenders. A quiet creak on the stairs broke her thoughts. Mary appeared, wearing one of her old sweaters, her hair tied loosely, her face pale, but calm. She looked older than she had a week ago. Older, but lighter, too. Grace stood quickly. "Hey, you should rest." Mary smiled weakly. "I've rested enough." She poured herself a cup of coffee, her hands trembling only slightly. "I watched the news this morning. They suspended Rachel pending investigation. The board's been dissolved. Parents are demanding a full audit." Grace's eyes widened. "So it worked." Mary nodded. "It worked." She let out a breath that seemed to carry years of pain, though I can't tell if it feels like a victory or a loss. Grace tilted her head. "Why would it feel like a loss?" Mary looked out the window, her voice quiet. "Because in the end, truth doesn't erase what was done. It just exposes it. Justice doesn't bring peace, it demands you keep fighting to hold it." Grace understood. She'd hoped the truth would feel like healing, like closure. But it didn't, not completely. It was messy and raw. The scars were still there, even if the world finally saw them. They ate breakfast in near silence until Grace finally said, "Mom, what you did, people might call extreme, but I think you were right." Mary met her gaze gently. "I wasn't right about everything. I was angry, and I let that anger become my compass." Grace frowned. "But you were fighting for justice." Mary smiled sadly. "Justice isn't revenge, Grace. It's not about destroying people. It's about rebuilding what's broken. I lost sight of that for a while. When Rachel betrayed me, all I could see was fire. But you reminded me that truth doesn't need to burn everything to shine." Grace felt tears gather in her eyes. "You saved me, Mom." Mary reached across the table, her voice trembling. "No, sweetheart. You saved me." They sat together for a long moment, holding hands across the table. The doorbell rang suddenly. Both of them were startled. Mary hesitated, then went to open it. Detective Lang stood there, no longer in his raincoat, just a plain shirt and tired eyes. He gave a respectful nod. "Morning, Mrs. Miller." "Grace." "Detective," Mary said cautiously. "Is everything all right?" He nodded. "Better than all right. The investigation's moving fast. Rachel has confessed to tampering with evidence and leaking the files. She tried to frame you, but the footage your daughter found sealed the case." Mary exhaled slowly, her voice unsteady. "So it's really over?" Lang gave a small smile. "As over as things like this get. But there's something else." He handed Mary a small brown envelope. "The board is reopening the investigation into every complaint from the last 5 years. They're forming a new committee. They asked if you considered joining it." Mary froze. "You're serious?" He nodded. "They want someone who won't look away." For the first time in months, Mary smiled, a real one, fragile but true. Maybe this time they'll listen. Lang tipped his hat slightly. "They already are." Then he turned and left, leaving the faint smell of rain and coffee in the doorway. Mary closed the door and stood still for a moment, clutching the envelope. Grace watched her. "You're going to do it, aren't you?" Mary nodded. "If I can turn all that pain into something that helps someone else, then yes, I have to." Grace smiled softly. "Then maybe that's what Dad meant." Mary turned. "What do you mean?" Grace hesitated. "He said once that you couldn't stop fighting because you cared too much. I think he was wrong about how he said it, but not about what it meant." Mary's eyes softened, full of something between sorrow and pride. Maybe he was right about that. They spent the rest of the day cleaning, quietly reclaiming their home from the chaos. The walls that once echoed with shouting now hummed with stillness. Grace washed the bloodstains off her old backpack, the one she'd been carrying the day she was attacked. It felt symbolic, like scrubbing away a nightmare. Later, as evening fell, they went for a walk. The air was cool, washed clean by days of rain. The sun dipped low, painting the streets gold. For the first time in so long, Grace didn't flinch when she saw her reflection in a passing window. She didn't see the victim anymore. She saw someone who had survived, who had stood in the storm and stayed standing. Mary watched her daughter, her chest swelling with something deep and quiet. She had spent so long trying to protect Grace from the world, but maybe the real strength had been letting her face it and seeing her rise again. At the edge of town, they reached the old school gates. A chain hung across them now, the building still under investigation. Grace stared for a moment. "It looks smaller," she said softly. Mary nodded. "It always does when you stop being afraid of it." They stood there in silence, the golden light spilling over them, the wind rustling through the trees. Grace turned to her mother. "Do you think things ever really change?" Mary looked up at the sky, the last rays of sunlight catching her eyes. "Change doesn't happen all at once, sweetheart. It starts with someone refusing to stay silent. And that's what we did." Grace smiled faintly. "Then I guess we did change something." Mary placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "We changed the ending." As they walked back home, the horizon blushed with the last traces of day. The shadows stretched long and soft behind them, but they no longer looked like threats. They looked like reminders of what they'd endured, of what they'd lost, and of what they'd found again, each other. And though the world would still whisper, still doubt, still turn away at times, Grace and Mary knew that truth had its own kind of quiet power. It didn't always roar. Sometimes it simply stood its ground. In that silence, in that fragile peace, they finally began to heal. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.